Hi. Well, just corrective administrative things. We have, I sent you an email about two things of correction, which I gave out again. What I'm doing is I switched 8 and 9. I'm switching 8 and 9. I had number 8 originally at number 9, number 9 at number 8. I just switched it because it makes more sense, okay? I don't know why that happened. That switched the other way. Something happened at one time, and I think that happened I think it got stuck in the syllabus, and I changed it back. Also, I will tell you, I told people we have I gave you a notice about classes, because we're scheduled, we have 17 slots this semester, sessions technically, but we only teach 15, including the exam. The exam week for you guys is the 15th. We'll be on June 15th, we'll have our exam. That's the 15th session. But that means two things. One, the 20th, which is after Easter, right? Because the Tuesday before is canceled because of Easter Monday, right? Easter Monday, then the Tuesdays is no class. I decided to utilize. It was really my wife's decision, because I said we could have had we could have had the Thursday before, Holy Thursday off, or that, but she doesn't want to rush coming. She did not want to rush coming back from her family, so therefore we said, okay, we have Thursday, so we have a longer Easter break, okay? So we have on the 20th, no class on the 20th of April. Our next class after that is when we come back, and then we have one class, and then we have the May holidays. Technically, the class is scheduled for the day, but I'm going to use that as my other day off for the class. So instead of coming back on so it's May 4th. May 4th is the day off, and therefore there's no reason to come back that day. So those are 2 days on the schedule that's off, and it's been like this. We return back on May 11th, and we do revolution. We do change and revolution, week 10, and then we have no interruptions from that. Okay. This is weird. Our day is a day within. It's an official class session still. The 15th for the exam is doing it, but it's also technically in the exam schedule. It says but I'm told that it's there, but no one is going to schedule that then. So let's hope that's true. But it's in the OSUS as an official class session, so it's an official class session. And usually we only get our stupid evaluation things the week before the end of the session, so therefore that's going to be probably then when it happens as well. Okay, so those administrative issues are there. I will just tell you the next. I want to get my. I did something and I gave myself notes about this, and now the notes are hiding. The notes are hiding because I gave myself a very extensive note on the exams. The only thing I know is that there will be I can tell you there's going to be a quiz next week. Next week before the thing, we'll have our next quiz, the fourth quiz. Then on the next quiz will happen on the break, when we come back after the break. And then the quizzes will happen, we'll have 9 quizzes overall. Okay?
Including the ones we have?
What?
Including the ones we have?
Yeah, 9 quizzes over, no. Including everything. So we have done 3 so far, so that means there'll be 6 more, okay? Okay, so therefore there'll be 1 next week covering the previous. I usually do it this way, that a quiz always covers not the week we do it, but the previous week. Or the previous 2 weeks if there was not a quiz, okay? That's how we're doing it. As we see up there, today's topic is on the schedule is modern regimes. And it's kind of funny, why am I doing moderns first? Because Well, that is the typical approaches, and I think I want to address the modern regime before going to classical regimes, because the classical regime, I think, offers us a way to understand political behavior in terms of how parts move. Because ancient political science, the difference between modern political science and ancient political science was modern political science, working within the framework of the modern state, often understood everything as a homogeneous whole, okay? It understood the state as a homogeneous unit. We'll talk about that a little bit soon. The ancients understood it as a discrete order of parts. In other words, a political community or a political body was basically an assortment of parts that shared a common life together, shared a community together, okay? So therefore, it was the political life and the structures of this was always understood as kind of an assortment of parts, where a part or a group of parts had control or authority over the whole, okay? And therefore, this allows us for a more, the older order kind of allows us a more, how you say, more dynamic model, where the state model often offers us kind of a homogeneous model, okay? And therefore less dynamic. And that you have to always add new models to it in order for it to do. Whereas the older model, the model itself offers you a dynamic to understand it. So that's how I think, and that's why I'm going backwards rather than forwards in that sense. I want to leave where we left off. Something we mentioned, this is the classical infamous typology regime of the ancients from Aristotle. And I kind of spent some time redoing it to emphasize what's going on here. The famous dichotomy of the regimes was the famous sixfold typology, right? Based upon two categories. The first, which I would label called the qualitative claim, this category here, which was whether the rule was the rule for the common advantage of all or for the ruler's advantage, okay? And therefore, the other criteria is the number of rulers. Whose rule? Should be R there, ruler, S, a number of rulers. One, few, and many, okay? That's the classic. This is the famous classical typology. And you're Mr. You can sign here. And, okay.
Yeah, sure.
And you're Mr. Alexander?
Yes, exactly.
You got that. And I'll give you that. And those are the highlights. Therefore, the typology is the intersection of those two. So kingship is the ruler, one ruler who rules for the common advantage, one ruler for the ruler's advantage is tyranny. This is the argument. Now we're going to show the qualitative claim is the one, the quantitative claim is the rule of one, rule of many, rule of few, okay? Or no, sorry, rule of one, few, many, right? That's the qualitative claim. The quantitative, quantity, right? The qualitative claim, the quality of the rule, whether it's rule for one's own advantage or rules for the sake of the common benefit. What is another kind of rule? The rule for the ruled, the benefit of the ruler, and this is where the Aristotle differs from Plato. Plato distinguishes between the ruler's advantage and a ruler should rule for the ruled, and the ruler rules for his own advantage. That's how Plato did it. Aristotle doesn't do that. Aristotle kind of rejects that conception. He says, no, common advantage. Common means all, everyone, the whole body. In other words, and I will talk about how, in many ways, Aristotle sets us up and then destroys it by arguing the quantitative doesn't count. The quantitative, in other words, he does this with a famous discussion of oligarchy. What is oligarchy? What's more important about oligarchy? Oligarchy normally is understood as the rule of the few, but it's also the rule of the rich, right? We think of oligarchs, we think of rich people getting their ways, right? So what matters? What happens when you have a city where most of the population are the very rich? Is this a democracy or is this an oligarchy?
It's democracy.
No. Because it isn't a democracy because why? What matters? Is it their equality that matters? Or does it, or does it the fact that they're rich? In other words, the nature of the characteristic of a democracy is that it usually means the people, right? The poor, the vulgar, demos, the laborers, the workers. If the workers are in charge, democracy, and the claim of democracy ultimately will be equality, that no one is better than anyone else, so all are free, and therefore, but we need a principle to govern us, so we say majority rule, right? In other words, majority rule is simply just a principle of a democratic system. But the principle is that no one's claimed to be better than anyone else, right? So therefore, what defines democracy? Equality. But what happens if you have a regime where most of the people are rich, and what depends is that you have to be rich to be able to do anything, hold office, or have any say or rights in this system? That's more of oligarchy. In fact, this is one of the dangers of most modern democracies, is we assume that democracy, we have this conception that democracy means, we've made everything into a democracy, where they're not democracies. A lot of things call themselves democracies, but are not really democracies. And people often look at places that they think is horrible, but they're democratic. Because what does democracy really mean? Democracy means that the majority rules. That's all it means. The people, everyone has a vote, and the majority rules. Does it mean protecting the minorities? No. What happens to a minority what does happen to a minority in a democratic system? They lose. What they want isn't important, because why? They can advocate it, but they won't never get their way. Why? Because they're the minority. And if you allow a minority to trump, okay, this is the word Trump. What does the word Trump mean? To trump something.
Like go through?
No. To trump it's a card term. It means the winning card. A trump is always the winning card. It means it nullifies everything else. That's why it's kind of funny, his name, right? Trump. Names matter. Okay? Trump means you're a winner. You're the winning hand. You can't. In other words, if I have a trump card, you can't win. A trump always wins in this sense. Okay? So what can a minority trump if the minority has a right to trump the majority? This is not a democracy. This is an oligarchy. Librum veto is not a democratic principle. If you require everyone's consent, this allows and any one person can veto it. This means what? This is the rule this is an aristocratic principle, where any one individual can say, sorry, no. The individual, it's aristocratic, not democratic, not egalitarian. So therefore, this is the fundamental older understanding of things. Therefore, these regimes, and the famous typology is the, I'm sorry, I apologize, I gotta turn this off. The regime called regime, he uses that word, and we talked about that a little bit later. That's not important. But let us move to this problem. The problem here is, in the modern construction, we don't live in the older order. We live in the newer order. And the newer order has this conception of state and society. these two spheres. Now, we understood that we talked about society or Gemeinschaft or before Gesellschaft, Latin societas. There's no Greek equivalent word in Greek. What's happening here? It's artificial, created to fill wants and needs. It's based on consent, higher degree. We talked about this earlier in a previous week. We compared community versus society a little bit. What I'm doing here is I'm comparing the concept of state to this. In other words, there is a state is a body framed by a society, no natural limit to its size, its constructive making, resting on the consent of the constituting parts. In other words, there's no limit in a state. The modern state has no fundamental limit. Very much like a society. A society is, because it's a contracting entity, it emerged, and actually, what's so interesting, I add this category, I didn't talk about this earlier. Durkheim, from Emil Durkheim, argued that society emerges out of the division of labor. In other words, the division of labor and parties and contracting and things like this allows for the construction of a very complicated society. This is why Marx is full of shit. Marx really wants to return. Marx's understanding of communal man is man as hunter-gatherer. When we were hunter-gatherers, there was no property. Why? Because everyone shared everything in the little group. Okay? Yes, it was bonds. Everyone did everything. The community agreed. Now, the hunter-gatherer society is very communal. Because why? Because life is shit. You're gonna die. You have to. Everyone has to work, or everyone dies. The hunters go hunt the food. The gatherers get these things. Everyone is equal in that one fundamental sense. Although Thurston Veblen in his classic, the American scholar Thurston Veblen makes the argument. This also creates a division. The hunters and the gatherers. The hunters are noble. The gatherers are slavish. The hunters, sexual division of labor. Who becomes the hunters? Men. Who becomes the gatherers? Women and children. Therefore, status emerges, right? This is Thurston Veblen's classic theory of the leisure classes. Makes the point that class division emerges out, the fundamental or earliest elements of class divisions emerges out of the hunter-gatherer worker division of labor. So you can, therefore, as division of labor becomes more complicated, society becomes more complicated, can grow. So the only reason why you can have a modern society is because of capitalism, not in spite of capitalism. Modern large-scale nations are only, as a political conception, as a society, is only possible because of the capitalist market models. So the interplay between economic advanced concepts of division of labor builds the possibility of a larger scale society. So state and society are kind of synonymous constructions in this way. They both rise out of rationality and intentionality. They rest on rationality and legal kind of systems of legality. They're both based on consensual voluntary constructs. One is more voluntary, in the sense of interest and sharing utility. This comes out of the consent of the constituting parts. Forming, again, both of them have a common sense of all the members act together for utility. There's no natural limit towards that. The only limit is the willingness of the parts to share utility. So let's go to the next. This is the construction. This is the interconnected relationship between state and society. Now, what we do is we state and society, although they're in many ways they're the same phenomena, but state and society separates and will separate to the degree of how a society wishes to be kind of limit state power. In other words, the liberal dimension of this is separating the sphere of the state from the sphere of the society. A despotic system would be the state and society as totally the same thing. Therefore, the higher degree of separation the more liberal the system is. The real chaos would be anarchy, was when the state being the governing principle, right? The use of coercion, the use of violence, is absent completely from this, and that's not how possible. The absence of state completely to society would produce anarchy, and anarchy would be merely not a society, but merely the breakdown of society. There needs to be some level of state in a society in order to preserve the society. So if the sphere of the state was removed or destroyed, then the society, so therefore the withering away of the state, as Marx predicts, is a nonsensical thing. Because without the state, they would not, the argument, if men are perfect, you won't need the state. Well, but the problem is, that's just nonsense. Men are never going to be perfect. Human beings are never going to be perfect in that sense. So therefore, you cannot never get away from this. So the degree of state in society will intersect and interconnect based on the degree of interconnection. So this, I gave a kind of this picture here, this image here. I use this purposefully to kind of get you thinking about this, these two spheres. This is how the modern structure works. And how the political regimes work in here will be framing the interrelationship between these two. How they interact, how this interacts with this. In other words, the state interacts on the society. The organs of state. Now, if Aristotle had the sixfold typology, writers like Machiavelli, Machiavelli begins with an alternative. Machiavelli is very much reductionistic. Following the Romans, he reduces it into twofold characteristics. He reduces, in other words, he will reduce republics and principalities. Now, it's important to understand by doing this, he's accepting the Roman model. But he's leaving something out. It's very interesting what he leaves out. Kingship. Rex. In the Italian, there'd be Rex. If he's talking about kings, why doesn't Machiavelli title his book The Rex? He doesn't choose the Rex. He purposely picks the Roman model. And the Roman model, the biggest taboo for the Romans is the Rex. This is why Caesar got killed. Because everyone thought he was going to be king. Why did the Romans turn on Anthony? Because he wanted to become he and Cleopatra was a queen and wanted to give Rome. They wanted to give Rome an Egyptian style, Asiatic style monarchy, rule to it. And by the way, why did Octavius or Augustus survive as long as he did? Because he never allowed the word Rex to come in here. Imperatum means emperor means nothing. It means nothing. It means I am the guy who exercises imperium. Every general was an imperator in the Roman model. Dictatorship was just merely a republican institution. An emergency office. It was an office of the republic. It wasn't we understand dictator as this unconstitutional structure. The Romans had it as a constitutional form. An emergency office that the Senate gave for up to 6 months to a year. And then what happened was two guys had it for life. Which was the first guy? I remember his name. Sulla. Sulla had it for life, and then Julius had it for life. Octavius was smart by never keeping dictatorship for life. In fact, he kind of did away with even consulships. The Romans had consuls elected yearly. Proconsuls were people who exercised authority abroad. The Roman model of administration was very effective. The Roman model allowed for the political Roman Republic. The Republican model was very effective. The problem was the Republic couldn't maintain itself politically. What happened was Octavius was smart on this point by what? not destroying the republic, keeping the frame and images and institutions of the republic, but subverting it by exercising all rule within this imperial household. So the Senate and the institutions didn't control anything. His household controlled it. The Principitus, which means the first citizen. Principitus means first. Cipitus meant citizen, right? The first citizen. That's where the term prince came from. It's a civic term, not a royal term, not a monarchical term. So Machiavelli's distinction between republics and principalities, and for him, there's a variety of both. There's a variety, we talked about it earlier, if you get Machiavelli says there's a whole bunch of different principalities. There's hereditary, elective, new, ecclesiastical, all these types of principalities. There's a great varieties of principalities, and there's a great varieties of republic. There is democratic republics, there are oligarchic, aristocratic, ecclesiastical republics. In other words, for Machiavelli and Aristotle are much more in agreement in this. But in fact, we could even argue they fundamentally agree, because in many ways, Aristotle argues that really kingship isn't kingship in its own type it differs from political rule. Monarchy and kingship are differing kind from political rule. But there are kingships that are political. So therefore, there's some weird teaching. There's this kind of complex teaching that monarchy and political rule are different in kind, as is household rule, as is mastering slaves. These are not the same type of form of rule. They differ in kind. Aristotle, therefore, would agree with Machiavelli that there's different types of rule. But the difference here is Machiavelli agrees with Aristotle. They kind of agree, but at the same time, they kind of disagree. Machiavelli, in his own name, will say things that Aristotle would not say. He'd know, but he would not speak of. And therefore, that's the case. Now, Montesquieu, it's interesting. We got to go to Hobbes. Hobbes is before Montesquieu, following from Machiavelli. But what he does? He's the opposite of if Machiavelli gives us these two criterias, Hobbes completely rejects those two criterias. What he does is he basically goes back to Aristotle's discussion, and he says, Aristotle's big discussion over here, well, he's right and he's wrong. See, the distinction between this type and this type is merely that you like one and you hate the other. In other words, if this rule of the one, if you don't like it, you call it tyranny. If it's the rule of the few, you don't like it, you call it oligarchy. Rule of the many, now this is why I have to go back to here because it's kind of different. In other words, if you like it, the rule of the many is called democracy. If you don't like it, it's called mob rule. In other words, that it's only the thing that matters is whether it's the rule of the one, the few, and the many. Now, his argument is, which is best? Hobbes argues, which is the best is, okay, Alexander Pope had a famous poetry line. He's an English poet. He says, I should write it down. It's I don't remember the line, but it's Alexander Pope had this great poetic line. It says, what government best is the government that which government is best? He basically says, and he says, well, the government that is best is that one who is administered best, right? The one who is administered. Now Hobbes will say he's right, but what form of government works best? Which is the form of government? Which is the more effective way of administering something? Having one ruler, few rulers, or many rulers? Or one manager, a few managers, or many managers? making the ultimate decisions?
It depends on the perspective.
No. Organization principle 101. Just think about this. If you have to make the ultimate decision about something, right? Which is the one that's going to be able to effectively make a decision in a time of crisis or emergency? Would you want to have 20 people always arguing about things? Or having a few people arguing about things? Or the person, any organization structure at all always gives up one thing, a CEO, right? They don't put 3 people as CEO. They might put a board above a CEO to oversee him to make, and to, if they think he's abusing his authority, can remove him, right? But they don't govern day-to-day operations by having the board govern it. That'd be disaster. No organization would do that. So Hobbes basically says, no, therefore in this situation, monarchy, if you want to be ruled by the best, then of course monarchy must be it, Hobbes would argue. In other words, the second you have multiple heads, what do you have? Dispute. And on the issues of making ultimate decisions of life and death and security and preserving your safety and security, do you want people to be debating and arguing? Or do you want your life and goods secure? I mean, just look at the whole debate about Ukraine regarding NATO and EU. Imagine that was about a society, your safety, your Ukraine, and this community, and that all the members have to decide whether that you can be a member so you can be safe. Do you really want everyone really making that decision, or would you rather have one person who could make that decision and guarantee your security, and not have the problem of making your... That's Hobbes' point about that, is about the question of effectiveness and efficiency. Now, of course, we'd like to have debate. Why? Because we want what happens to minority voices? Maybe the minority voice can persuade the majority, right? We'd like that. But the problem is, there's a difference between, in other words, the day-to-day administration of things versus the deciding of things. In other words, we can decide what we should do, we can deliberate. So therefore, we divide, we'll talk about this, we'll talk about dividing political action up between deciding about rules and executing laws, administering them. In other words, the functions of government are different from the action. In other words, these are at this level we're dealing with this, and I'm mailing Hobbes here because Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, to some degree Hegel, all agree with Hobbes in this. One, few, many. The question of effectiveness. They may not agree with Hobbes completely on effectiveness. Locke would favor an aristocracy. Rousseau favors democracy. Kant and Hegel favors quasi-democratic or popular rule. But their argument is simply very much similar to Hobbes's. Now, then we go to Montesquieu over here, and Montesquieu is just a version of Machiavelli, a more complicated one. His republics are the same. In fact, he will divide republics between democratic republics and oligarchic republics, right? Montesquieu will then talk about monarchies, and monarchies are very interesting. He says, the prince, in his classic spirit of the laws, he says, well, the principle of a republic, the virtue of a republic is what? Equality. Political virtue is the love of equality. Oh, how can that be when you have oligarchs? Well, still, it's the citizens the oligarchs see themselves as equal to each other in that sense, even. Monarchies, what drives on monarchies? Honor. So therefore, you only get aristocracies in monarchy system, anarcho systems. In other words, the aristocratic culture emerges out of monarchical rule. Honor becomes the principle of monarchies. And he will then talk about despotism. What is the principle of despotism? Inequality also, but equality of fear. Everyone is in fear. Everybody lives in fear. There's no power. Everyone's a slave. Even the ruler himself is kind of a slave. He has to keep everyone, he's a slave because he has to dominate and control everyone else. He has no freedom. He has to live he lives in perpetual fear of everyone else. So everyone lives in perpetual fear of everyone else. And he makes the argument that you can tell, in other words, there's a connection between the type of interconnection between populations and the type of political systems one has. Montesquieu's Spirit of Law is a great book. Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws it's a very difficult book because it's very big, and it has no it's a very confusing book because there's no logic, no apparent logic to it either. It's like this kind of, and one of the great mysteries of the book is what is the order of the book? What is the structure of the book? And he makes some very interesting points about the nature of. It's a complete book. He talks about everything. He talks about Asia. He talks about the the new Americas. He talks about he talks about the interconnection between political rule and different societies. Okay, and basically he's the first real modern comparative political scientist that talks about China, Asia, Africa, the whole world. Aristotle doesn't know about Asia that much, except for Persia and North Africa. Doesn't really know dark Africa and doesn't really know India or further out. Okay, China or Asia. Montesquieu does, and he relies on all the accounts of all the traveler accounts that he went through to get very good accounts of what's going on at the time. And that what he does is he gives a first kind of political anthropology. Now, he has a very interesting argument about climate and freedom. In other words, geography, resources, climate interconnect to personality type, and personality type determines the degree of freedom there is. The connect of how honor-loving will reflect aspects of climate and also aspects of the ecology that one comes from. So Montesquieu is a very interesting fellow on that stuff. Now, the next person that comes out of here, and a person you study a lot at American Studies, would be Tocqueville. The French author Tocqueville, Alexis de Tocqueville, famous Democracy in America. He's also famous, his other works that should be read also, the Reflections on his book, The Ancient Regime and the French Revolution. I think the French Revolution and the Ancient Regime, I think it's flipped around like that. But his other good works on the nature of revolution, nature of democracy in Europe. Now, he argues in both Democracy in America and his other works that in the modern world, aristocracy, in other words, equality is one. Once you have the modern world, democratic equality happens, right? All the other regimes, monarchy, kingship, are illegitimate. Aristocracy, monarchy, kingship, aristocracy, all of those are illegitimate. What is left over? What is the only dichotomy of political rule that remains? He says it's either democracy or despotisms. Non-democratic or non-democratic regimes. Any non-democratic regime, to the degree it's not democratic, it's perceived as despotic. And very much this is the world we live in. We live in a world like this. We think this way. The modern European world understands this in this narrow dichotomy of democratic. It's either democratic. Now the problem here is that what we understand as democratic often is itself a lie. But we still, even though it's a lie, we still operate with this dichotomy. A democratic regime is our understanding of democracy is democratic, and anything that deviates from that is what? Despotic. So if our understanding of democracy is this European Union and this human rights regime, then therefore Orban or PIS Poland must be despotic. Because why? It's the opposite. In other words, if we are democratic, if us human rights people that we believe in global human rights and internationalism and global communications and the idea that the minorities can trump the rights of the majority, if this is what democracy means, which doesn't mean that, but if we believe this is democracy, then anything that is divergent from that is undemocratic and therefore despotic. So therefore, this is Tocqueville's warning. This was he says this is the nature of democracy, and this is the flaw of the modern mind in that sense. And this is why that kind of model doesn't always work. But we'll see this model is going to be the dominant model. Tocqueville's model, twofold model, is going to be the very, very dominant model of how political science in the 20th century creates dichotomies of regimes. Because let's look at this. This is one of the classic political systems perceptions, right? Types of rule. This is the old-fashioned version, right? We either hereditary right. The rights of this is a kind of a simple conception. Three things. There's rights of rule, forms of government, and types of systems. Right? Rights of rule is hereditary right. That means your father was it or your mother was it, therefore you're right. You got it. There's a right based on hereditary. That means the other one is public vote, a vote. People votes on it. So this is the two possible rights of rule. Your right to rule, the right to hold your office is because your father had it. I inherit the right. Or it's a vote. Now, who's the public? That can differ on the system. Because in an autocratic system, there's only one vote, the autocrat. Okay? In a democracy, now, there's two types of forms of government, monarchies or republics. Again, this is very kind of Machiavellian. This means republics tend to be either there is going to be a kind of unitary decision-making, centralized system of control, or republican multi-headed system of control. And then the forms of things, the types of these political systems can be democratic, autocratic, aristocratic, plutocracy, oligarchy, oligarchy, that means mob rule and anarchy. These are the famous kind of, this is coming up the Wikipedia kind of approach to the different forms of government. More modern, because we have all these types of governments, so we can have one. There's a great one, it's called, there's even more. There is kakocracy, means the rule of the rule of the shit. I mean, it's from Greek. It means the shit ruled by the shit. Okay, this means the rule by the worst sort. Or kleptocracy. What does a klepto mean? Thieves. The rule of thieves. Some people argue that places like Ukraine and Russia are what? Oligarchic kleptocracies. And Poland is almost on that kind also, right? All the former Soviet worlds are more oligarchic kleptocracies. Maybe some degrees of oligarchy. One is more kind of republican versus, we can say Poland is a republican oligarchic kleptocracy versus Russia being an autocratic oligarchic. In other words, you could have kind of variations of the fundamental themes in that sense. Now, Samuel Feiner is an important political scientist. He was an English political scientist, and he came up with his fourth typology. He created that. His typology was kind of an attempt to overcome both Aristotle and also what we call the Tocquevillian simplistic model. He argued this four-place model. between palace, which means the palace versus the forum. Palace is like there's going to be a place where the elites are going to govern, where the elites govern. Or the forum is where, what is the forum? The forum is where everyone, the marketplace, where everyone is going to govern. Okay, the palace is someplace above. The forum is the marketplace, or the place where everyone gathers and everyone participates. Right. This is is the regime based on high, from a place on high, a palace above that looks down, or the regime is it within the people, within the market itself, right? Within the place where all the people rest. And then there's a distinction between nobility versus the church. Nobility is what? This means there's going to be an elite. The elite is going to be those who are nobles, the better ones. Now this may be experts. This may be the decisions are going to be ruled by experts, and then there's going to be or the church. Now church means either religion, but also can mean believers, right? Environmentalism is a belief. Human rights is a belief system. In other words, if you really believe in human rights, and that's the thing, you belong to the Church of Human Rights. If you think human rights is the dominant thing that should govern everyone's life, that all political orders must submit to the belief that human rights should be dignified and that's a belief system. And that should the belief system trump what is what experts in something says? Okay, this is why his model is a very interesting model. So therefore, there's possible relationships. First of all, there's propositions. Palace forum is always going to be opposed in some degree. You very rarely will have a palace and forum kind of system combined, and you will have a problem of nobility and church. Therefore, you can have a combination palace church, church palace, or church forum, forum church, forum nobility, nobility forum, palace nobility, nobility palace. You will not. It's very unlikely that you'll have the combination nobility church, because these are oppositions in some ways to each other, to some degrees. So the relationships are always angular to these different dichotomies, and then that goes into there. That's the finest things. Now, Robert Dahl, American political scientist, he died in the early 2000s. He was for very much important American political scientist. His book on polyarchy, his famous research on polyarchy. Now he comes up with this model of public inclusiveness and public orientation. Full public orientation, representation, and no representation. Inclusiveness means who can be involved in like this. Competitive, there's full competitive oligarchies here. In other words, this is full inclusiveness. So these are polyarchy. Polyarchy means many rule, poly rule. It's kind of like he doesn't like democracy because he thinks democracy has a very specific meaning, and that he therefore he says it's beyond this. And therefore he says inclusiveness and competitiveness, right? This is the opposite of this one, okay? This model is if it's low inclusiveness, low competitiveness, oligarchy. Low inclusiveness, competitiveness, competitive oligarchy. Highly competitive, highly inclusive polyarchy. Low competitiveness, but inclusive hegemony. These are two different varieties that show the same typology. The classic typologies of these things. So you have competitive oligarchies, closed hegemonies, autocracies, you call that. Here's inclusive hegemonies, and here's a polyarchy. The last thing is cut off in this image. I apologize. For some reason, when I tried snipping the image, little words disappeared. Charles Tilly is a sociologist who kind of stole. He kind of followed using Tocqueville's model, but followed democracy, non-democracy, right? And then instead of this, is governmental capacity. He goes, okay, is the government capable or not capable? So high capacity non-democratic, low capacity non-democratic, high capacity democratic, low capacity democratic. Okay, what's wrong with here? Well, the thing is, democracy is one of the categories of the thing is democratic. So therefore, instead of being a good regime typology, this is more kind of doesn't really create a regime typology. It creates a question of how regimes are capable are they. In other words, it doesn't distinguish between democracies. It doesn't really show how a democracy is democratic. This kind of thing becomes arbitrary again to this kind of Rousseauian, Tocquevillian democracy non-democratic, right? Therefore, this is here, and then the question of capacity here. Tilley's model, he wrote a book, Democracy, and we'll read about this also in next, we'll be reading a little bit today, I think. It was Tilley's chapter 1, 2, and 3 were in today's reading. It's his book on regimes and repertoires, which introduces the topics, and he deals with these concepts here. Some of these graphs are from that book. Therefore, this is a very interesting thing. Now, this is something I'm going to bring in, because Sam Huntington, you probably know him because of, you probably read Huntington article somewhere, like either his stuff, Who We Are, regarding Latinos and American identity, or his famous Clash of Civilizations, article from that led to the famous debate with Fukuyama. This is from his 1968 book, Political Orders and Changing Society. And he argued that this is his type of political systems. And he says, okay, how do you do this? Well, ratio of institutional, this is the ratio of institutionalism to participation. High participation means civic, low participation means Praetorian. And then he says political participation, high, medium, and low. High means modern, medium usually transitional, and low usually means traditional societies. And then he said, what? Okay, a civic one, high, this is Ethiopia, this is Ethiopia 1960s, 1970s. It's organic, he calls it organic. It's a high civic, low motto, which is civic and traditional. Whereas Praetorian and traditional is oligarchical, and essentially he takes Paraguay. Then he looks at civic traditional. This is Whig. He calls it Whig, and he said Chile of the 1960s. This is before Pinochet. Then you see that is Egypt, radical. A Praetorian model with transitional, medium level of participation. And then you have high participatory, but high civic. This is participant. He said Soviet Union, and then he says high Praetorian, and then mass Argentina. So therefore, he has this idea of participants, high civic. Of this, I think this is why he's kind of strange. He's saying, why Soviet Union? Because this is what he argues, the idea of systems. That there was the way this works. Participation, project, participation there, high civic. Now, this is his other model. This is the idea, the political institutionalization, and this is political participation, low, medium, high, low to high, and therefore this line here divides the criteria between civic and Praetorian. That how he works in a certain way. But he means Praetorian means, civic means that everyone does it. Praetorian means there's an elite that guides the civic order. Praetorian means that it's kind of a group of people guide and control the system. That's why I disagree with his Soviet Union analysis. Now, this is David Easton's famous model, the system model. Easton came up with this model. This is systemic. This is structured. This doesn't really talk about regimes per se, but this is his idea of system. In other words, the political system, whatever it is, there, inputs, outputs, the environment surrounds it, and what happens is every decision, every output that comes out, decisions or policies, right, that come out of the political system, these create feedback loops. So demands create decisions. A demand that leads to support to the system. Demands go into the system. It produces a policy. and then this causes feedback. This is the nature of the so-called Eastern system in that sense. I just mention that because this is the thing. Now, this is the classic. These two are the classic things you find in political theory, about testing your ideology, right? You do these ideology tests, right? Where do you ideology test? Well, this is but this is what? This is just a Ricart scale. What is a Ricart scale? Ricart scale is a 5-point, strongly agree, neutral, strongly agree, agree, strongly agree. It's the famous 5-point scale. No opinion, agree, strongly agree, slightly disagree, strongly disagree. Right, the 5-point scale. Well, this is what the 0 is here, right in the middle. Okay, and there's 4 criteria. It's authority, freedom. How much authority you like versus the opposite of freedom. Freedom and authority are in opposites. That's an assumption. That's a bad assumption, because I would argue that the idea that no authority, the absence of authority would be perfect freedom is one of the most absurd concepts in the world. But it's common model. And the other criteria is the amount of 0 authority, the complete authority. And then emphasis on the group or emphasis on the individual. How much equality? No equality, total equality, right? Equality, this is the liberty equality dichotomy. That's classic. And then you have this idea, representative democracy will be here, democratic socialism and democracy. Libertarianism at this level, fascism or absolute monarchy is here, and mob rule is here. Now, this is weird because it flips around. This is what? This is the freedom, liberty, order, security. So freedom, liberty is therefore there, and up here is equality, economic equality. So this is high liberty. This is more order. Okay, so it's inverted. This has an inverted liberty scale. If liberty was 0 here and high here, then this would flip around, okay? This model would flip around. The bottom scale is reverted in that sense. This is a bad design from a political science sort of view. But I had to pick models, I had to pick images that I work. I was lazy, and I was deciding why recreate wheels, Because I want to add some things. So here's your moderate. Here is high order, but low level of low level of equality, conservatism. High level of equality, emphasis on order, populism. High level of economic liberty, but in other words, what is it? This is that weird. This is the liberalism, libertarianism. Libertarianism is there's less equalities. There's no economic liberty. Is that you're free to do what you want. There's not going to be equality economically. Here, everyone is economically equal. So liberalism is up here. Libertarian, and that should be, this is the classic American political model, right? This is the classic American political model. Between what we call moderates are here. Liberalism, classical political liberalism of the Democratic Party here, social liberalism, we call this, social liberalism, libertarianism, populism, and conservatism. Those are the famous classic model in the structures. Now, in many ways, we're saying this gives us the frame by which we can understand political life and the modern state and how it operates in this sense. But we have to understand that there's fundamental limitations here. All these models often assume certain things of inclusivity and participation, which is okay. That's empirical standard. But to what degree does that offer a criteria of different types of regimes? Most of these regime typologies do not really allow you to distinguish one type of regime or not. It often assumes that it's either going to be an oligarch. In other words, either if it's a modern, like the problem with something like Huntington's situation is Huntington's model is assuming that most of the situations he's going to be talking about here are not really going to be, European. He's going to be doing not, in other words, he's going to be saying that this model excludes, this is not liberal democracy. Liberal democracies are not being looked at here. This model is kind of like saying non-democratic models, things that are not going to be established as modern liberal democracies, what kind of political systems they are, and therefore he comes up with this characteristic. So it's not a universal system. You notice he gives no European country model fits in there. He's talking about, and therefore his model very much implies in many ways that it's not a uniform model thinking all. It's a model for a particular, very specific category of political, a range of systems. These are the non-democratic, the non-developed, non-liberal democracy criteria. We're going to have this categorization of this. So there's no one single regime model that fits all for someone like Huntington. Huntington offers you a whole range of different ones. The book is filled with these different, like looking at monarchies, traditional versus modern monarchies. Okay, he'll look at every type of alternate political system at that level, and then but then when he turns to developed nations, he accepts kind of the traditional simplistic model of he focuses on presidential systems versus parliamentary models. Well, that's the classic presidential model, or the parliamentary model. Therefore, modern democracies, you either get one or the other, or a hybrid, a semi-presidential model like the French. So therefore, we go back to the criteria here of understanding what is going on at the level of the state and the level of the political system. Modern regimes thus have to understand itself. It's a much more reductionistic conception. Why? Because it's really looking at the relationship back here, the relationship of state and society. The regime question is always fundamentally addressing the intersect of the type of state and its relationship to society. Hence, this is what leads us to these kind of models, right? These kind of models over here, back down here. This is the amount of government, how much state interaction towards the question of people's freedom. How much government action should government allow people to do what they want, or should government dictate what people do on this? Should government allow people to have, have greater variety of economic liberty? That means they can do what they want, or they should be all economic equality? Should they constrain their economic liberty? So there's not that much different. In other words, therefore, they will not, because if you have economic liberty, what's going to happen? Economic liberty means people can do what they want, and therefore some will be rich and some will be poor. My favorite story about this. In World War II, the Allied POWs in Germany, right, when they come to the prisoner of war camp, what do they have on them?
Uniforms.
That's it, right? No money, no anything else, right? No other goods. And every month they would get and if the Germans were nice to them, they would get everyone would get identical amount of their POW box. The Geneva box. Geneva Red Cross would send them a box, in it would be like a pantyhose, cigarettes, candy bars, some tea, instant coffee, instant tea bags, sugar, enough for people for 1 month, a ration for 1 month. Okay? So what happened? Everyone had the same amount. This is the greatest social science experiment of all times. What happened in the POW camp? All of a sudden they became millionaires and poverty. The rich and the poor emerged. Why? Because everything was for exchange. And they could even bribe guards. I mean, what did they need pantyhose for? The German guards did. So the German guards could give them a camera. I'll give you some American cigarettes and American pantyhose. In other words, the goods on that thing provided means of barter, which then allowed, all of a sudden, it allowed what happened? Okay, the distinction between those who had to gratify their in other words, there's two types of mechanisms of utility gratification. If I have a want, I immediately gratify it, or I delay my gratification. Do I gratify my desire now, or do I kind of instead of me consuming the candy bar, you want the candy bar badly enough, right? You want a candy bar, so I will say to you, okay. Give me your one candy bar. What do you don't want? Okay, I want. You have something to trade with me. Okay, I want two of your. Give me your pantyhose, and I'll give you the candy bar. Okay. What I do is I'm trying to get my advantage, so I have what? Things I can trade to I can go. I know the German, the guard over there. I can speak German, or he can speak English, and I can give him a pantyhose, and he will sell it in the black market. He gives me either cash, or he gives me he makes money from that himself, and then he brings me a camera or something I want that I can't get in the camp. Maybe he gets me some extra food or something like that. That I can do what? Oh, your sugar. Okay. What can I do with sugar and water? Water and sugar in a pot boiling. What? No, you can do that, but what is something even better? If I make a distilling unit. If I take water and make a distilling unit where I steam it up and put it up here and have a thing of sugar water and I keep distilling it over time a couple times, what do I get? Alcohol. If I have a couple kilos of sugar, I can make a couple liters of alcohol. And what would these guys who can't get alcohol do? How do you think they make alcohol in prisons? They do it. So what happens? People will be inventive. They trade. They'll do this, and all of a sudden, there's going to be people with things that everyone else wants. They want very bad. That they will for a little glass of alcohol, camp alcohol. How much cigarettes would you give? How many goods you want to do. And then there's also a situation like this. You have those cigarettes, you have nothing to give, so you promise me what? I know next month you're going to get a package. So you go in debt. You go in debt, and I say, I'll give you the candy bar. Give me a couple cigarettes now, and I'll give you my candy bar next month. You create, people get in debt, and then people get very rich. There's a great movie. It's called Stalag 17. Watch it. It's a classic. It's the idea of, this is the problem. In every prisoner camp, what would happen is somebody would become millionaire. How? Because he was the guy who had the smart of not gratifying his gratification now, he delayed gratification, and he basically traded stuff and made profit. So that's the problem. Socialism will never work because we're not the same. We have different levels of gratification. People will always want to, even if you have a system of perfect, even if you have a system of everyone every month get the same amount of money, there's still going to be a situation where there's going to be a few rich and many poor. You can never escape that. This will always be about by the nature, because different people have different abilities regarding their ability to restrain their, in other words, the ability to constrain your desires. That's the problem with economic, the modern state is never going to solve it. What it can only do is the modern state can only, what it do is constrain its worst effects. So back to a perception of the state in this sense. We go back to the problem here. The modern state model, we go all the way back to our little graph, is this problem of the intersection between the state and society again. And how does it interact and how does it relate to each other? One of the dangers of this is the state being too powerful. One of the models, one of the things, I mean, we can't read that much, and I actually think if I'm going to do, we look at things, I say, oh, I'm going to make less reading, because I understand there's a lot of reading here, but at the same time, it's always good to know this reading. It's that you should, some of this reading is going to be very fundamental for you for the rest of your time at studies, you know. You're going to go into political science or social science. Some of this stuff is going to be key readings that will shape other material. But there's other stuff I could have added, like economy, some aspects of political economy and something like that. But the state and society aspect, this tension between state and society, is an interesting one in this sense. This division here, degrees of division. The need to divide and separate state and society is very much tied to it. And this is tied to perceptions of power. In other words, one of the biggest problems here is that we have this I've talked about this before, about the question of utility. No, I talked about the candy bar problem, haven't I? That in other words, a good is not infinite. There's no infinite. In other words, any good that you get, your ability to enjoy it or utilize it, there's a certain point of limitation towards it. There's always what we call in economics is a Pareto optimality moment. Pareto is a French, Vincent Pareto, Italian economist, very brilliant guy. He came up with the idea of this point of utility. He understood that there's a moment of utility that once you keep on adding more, you get less and less benefit. He came up with the idea of diminishing marginal utility. Okay. Now Ricardo also kind of hit on this, but it was Pareto that saw that there was a point on the utility curve, and after that point, then you don't get any more. This is the highest utility point you're going to get, maximum utility of any good. And then keep on pushing for that good, you end up getting negative results after that utility point. Now, Pareto also understood that there was a problem here. Pareto in this thing called the Italian school of social theory. It's Princeton Pareto, it's Robert Michaels, and then it's Giannanti Mosca. And then the Marxist student of his, many of my colleagues like the Marxist guy. You will be introduced to, what's his name? I'm blanking. Come on. I'm blanking. I know the name. It's going to drive me crazy. It's political, his prison diaries. Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci is, many of my colleagues are Gramsciists, okay? They're Marxist Gramsciists, they're postmodern Gramsciists, okay? Gramsci is the hero of the postmodern left in that sense, and clearly culture studies people. I don't like, Gramsci is just problematic in many ways because I think he misunderstands Mosca. And Mosca and Roberts, by the way, Michel Roberts was a socialist. Roberts, in fact, when he studied socialist parties in Germany and Italy, he discovered something. He discovers that all the socialist parties are always ruled by elites. That, in other words, political parties there's a distinction in political parties, is that the leadership of political parties often have more in common with the other leaders of other parties than with the people they represent. He argued that what's always going to happen this is the so-called iron law of oligarchy, that in any complex hierarchy, any complex large-scale model, the larger the model, the more likely there's going to be an oligarchic elite. In other words, you only have egalitarian government in small-scale units. Once you get large, complex societies, large, complex organizations, you cannot have a consensual democratic elite rule. What would have to happen is systems of reputation, and then once you have systems of reputation, elites emerge. Those who are acting as your representative bodies often will interact with other representatives to form a different elite, usually with the economic elite. And all of a sudden, they will have more in common with each other than with the people they represent. And as the elites, and the problem is, as the size of the organization grows, and as long as it's a unitary system, now if it's a federative system, this can prevent it, because you can have localized elites. Then what happens is the localized elites can then set up here, but the localized elites still control at this level. But if you have a unitary system, what happens? The elites that emerge in all the representative bodies will often merge with the national elites and therefore form the national elite. And therefore, the larger the body, the more the space between the elites increase. In fact, there's a rule. In other words, if there's too many elites, what happens to a system? If there's too many elites in a system, what will happen? Conflict, because the elites get jealous of each other. And what will happen is that they'll fight amongst each other. There's an economist, there's a historian slash zoologist slash Peter Turson at University of Connecticut. He created a model of human cycles of society. And he came an argument that if there's too many elites, if you produce too many elites, what will happen is social political turmoil happens. And what's happening is right now we have too many elites. The modern societies have produced too many elites, and because these elites there's not enough jobs and opportunities for them, so therefore they want revolution. So there's going to be social chaos and social turmoil because of this. And this is the problem, that once, as units, okay, it's called the inverted relationship. As an organization to work has a certain number of people, right? Regardless of size. The decision body will have to work this way, regard. Function of control, function of decision. Now, when it's a smaller scale entity, that set number is a larger percentage of the whole, right? But if the body grows, that number of people will not double, will not incrementally grow at the same scale as the society does. It grows at a much smaller scale. So what's going to happen to the percentage of the controlling elite versus the body politic? It'll shrink. So at one level, it's a 20. It can be a 60-40. 40% of the elites. This is a very egalitarian model, right? 60-40. Then what happens? The population quadruples. Then it becomes a 20-80. Then it quadruples again. What happens? It becomes 10-90. then that quadruples again. It becomes 99, 95.5. Okay? In other words, as the larger it grows, the size of the elite will shrink. And therefore, what does this create? This create a problem in that sense. Because what ends up happening is that the former elites who have gotten less and less, in other words, the people who might have been former elites, they're still within the system. But then what happens if new people want to compete with them? Or people who were their peers, who don't become elites, who think themselves equal to them? If the elite body becomes such a small fragment of the system, it's very easy for a new elite to emerge to replace the old elite. We'll talk about when we talk about this change in that sense. So therefore, this distinction of state and society is a very, very interesting one, because it's again the question of how much power do you have to do? How much coercion does it have to have? How much authority and how much control should the state have over the society? And the society, and when we understand society, we also understand economy. Some people argue, isn't economy another thing? No, I think state and society and economy are the same thing. As from a sociological point of view, economy and society are synonymous entities. The difference between a society and the state is the element of, as Weber said, is the exercise, legitimate exercise of coercion. How much coercion, how much force to maintain order? So therefore, the question then is, how much order do you want? Do you want the state body to regulate every order? That's a total state. In other words, that is the state, the authority of the state would be completely over-covering every aspect of society. Or do you want some degrees of separation? A complete separation where there's no state would be anarchy. But the problem with anarchy, as Hobbes perfectly pointed out in his Leviathan, the danger of anarchy is, well, if there's no governing, no rules of law and authority that does this, and everyone can do what they want, what happens? Everyone would live in terror because everyone would be only able to defend for themselves, and there'll be a war of all against all. That's why Leszek Kolakowski famously said that anarchy is the handmaiden of tyranny. That anyone who wants anarchy really ends up getting tyranny. Because what happens? Anyone who lived in anarchy, in a chaos of anarchy, would love anyone who gave them order. In other words, go to the war zones in Africa or anywhere, any place where there is kind of chaos. What happens? The victims, they will. If some warlord can not be a vicious monster, but give them security and they'll surrender to it. It's better than horror, right? This is one of the problems of anarchy. Anarchy leaves us to anyone who can give us security and peace, who can guarantee us our lives and guarantee us our things, will become, but the problem with that is that he will be, if he's a warlord and he's been having his way all the time, he will eventually decide to abuse it. So it's not, in other words, you have to, your safety and security is the whim of an individual. The purpose of the state was to remove that individual. The social contract was the people create the state in order to remove the whim of the autocrat, the whim of an individual. The king is not, in other words, in a social contract, there might be a king, but he's not. He's only a representative agent of the body politic. He's not the real. He doesn't really rule things. He is merely an executive. He's only the guy executing the authority of the thing. In other words, the general will through the social compact creates the rules. He might execute. He'll be the person executing and carrying out the rules, but he's merely still only an executive agent. He's no longer the man really in charge. The king is no longer merely the guy. The old kingship was that he's the king, he's my rules, I can do what I want. But kingship in terms of the idea of the Hobbesian framework of the new king, the sovereignty is not the king's will. The sovereignty is what? It's the collective will of in other words, it is all of the constituting parts, all the individuals who constitute the body politic, and their wills combined produces sovereignty. And they appoint the king. The king is their agent, representative agent to exercise their authority. That is the Hobbesian framework. Now, I'm going to stop here because this is a good place to stop. And we're done for the day. So we'll see you next week, okay?